Okay, and we're recording.
Okay. Good morning or good evening, as the case may be, for those of you who may be tuning in from abroad. This is welcome to the second session of our half-day virtual conference on the cost and consequences of war, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. I'm Linda Yar, for those of you who were not able to attend the first session. I'm a research professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and director of Partnerships for International Strategies in Asia, a program of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. In the earlier session, I quoted from a poem, The End and the Beginning, by Wisława Szymborska, a Polish Nobel Prize winner. And part of it, one stanza says, after every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Today, in this session 2, we will be speaking with representatives of organizations who are doing just that, trying to clean things up after the wars that our country has engaged in over the last 70 years. I'd like to, for those, to repeat that I'm very thankful to the Sigur Center for Asian Studies and the Chino Cienega Foundation for supporting this work. And we hope that these discussions will shed light on what is actually being done on the ground to make sure that the egregious harms that we learned about in the first session are being addressed and mitigated. I'm also grateful, I should mention, to our other co-sponsors who have put out the notice about this session. They are the Leadership Ethics and Practice Initiative of George Washington University, the GW Institute of Korean Studies, the Elliott School of International Affairs, the National Committee on North Korea, and the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. I hope that members of their organizations and their circle are also in attendance. We have today 3 representatives of organizations that have been working tirelessly to heal the wounds of war. First, we have Daniel Jasper. He's the Asia Public Education and Advocacy Coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee, where he has advocated for diplomacy, humanitarian cooperation, and peace building in North Korea and China since 2015. He has assisted and taken part in humanitarian delegations to North Korea and regularly participates in Track 2 dialogues with Chinese foreign policy experts. He is a member of the National Committee on North Korea, an advisory board member for the Coalition of Families of Korean and Cold War POW MIAs, an international advisor to the National Association of Korean Americans, as well as the founder and primary author of streetcivics.com. Previously, he worked at World Learning, where he administered State Department exchange programs, primarily with Iran. He has also worked for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Minnesota House of Representatives, and Congresswoman Betty McCollum. He holds a master's in public policy from Duke University and a bachelor's in global studies, cultural studies, and linguistics from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. I will be giving the biographies of each of our speakers who will be speaking in the order that I give them so that there's an easier flow from one speaker to the other. Next, we have Susan Hammond. She's the daughter of a U.S. Vietnam veteran. She became interested in post-war Southeast Asia after having traveled to Vietnam, and Cambodia in 1991. In 1996, after earning her MA in International Education from New York University, Susan returned to Vietnam to study Vietnamese. She became involved in fostering mutual understanding between the people of the U.S. and Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and in addressing the long-term impacts of war while working as the Deputy Director of the Fund for Reconciliation and Development from 1996 to 2007. During this time, she lived in New York, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, coordinating programs for FRD. In 2007, Susan returned to the home state of Vermont and founded the War Legacies Project, which focused on addressing the long-term health and environmental impacts of war, including the ongoing impacts of Agent Orange in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In 2019, Susan received the Vietnam Order of Friendship Medal for her more than 2 decades of work in Vietnam. Next, we turn to Heidi Kuhn, who is the founder and CEO of Roots of Peace, a humanitarian nonprofit organization founded in September 1997 with a vision to transform mines to vines, replacing the scourge of landmines with sustainable agricultural farmland. Her pioneering work empowers families living in war-torn regions with hope, leading to the economics of peace through export and trade. She attended the University of California, Berkeley, majoring in political economics, where those core beliefs were strengthened during the peace movement of the 1970s, setting forth a lifelong commitment to pioneering the footsteps of peace. Heidi and Roots of Peace have been the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2006 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Award, National Jefferson Award for Public Service, and the Rotary International Service Above Self Award. In 2018, she received the inaugural Earth Ethics Award from Marcus Noble, nephew of Alfred Noble, and presented to her at the United Nations in New York. And in 2019, Heidi received the Gandhi Global Family Award in New Delhi, the first American to receive this prestigious award on the 150th birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. With this, I'd like to turn to Dan Jasper for his presentation. And please remember that at the end, there will be time for Q&A. Thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction, Linda. I really appreciate it. And it's quite an honor to be invited to this conference and to share the stage with Susan and Heidi, who are quite distinguished. So thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I hope this works. Okay, I think that worked. Okay. So again, I really appreciate that introduction, and I think it's so important to have this conference and to situate these conflicts next to one another, because I think they are so intertwined. So I think this is a really important conversation. I'm going to focus my remarks on the Korean War. And just to give you a quick overview of my presentation here, I'll talk a little bit about the organizational background, the organization that I work for called the American Friends Service Committee. I'm going to give you a crash course in conflict history. I'm going to try to be quick about it, but it is quite a deep history, and it's really quite important to understand the present day circumstances as well. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about recent U.S. foreign policy towards Korea, and then I'm going to end on a few notes of further reading suggested materials for folks. So just quickly, the American Friends Service Committee is a Quaker organization. We were founded in World War I. It was meant to be an alternative means of service for Quakers to serve their country without using violence. Quakers are pacifists by nature, and so they looked for forms to help alleviate the suffering of those caught in conflict, as well as those who were even involved in the conflict as well. Since World War I, the organization has been involved in basically every major conflict in the war. And in the context of Korea, we were one of the first organizations to enter South Korea for reconstruction efforts after the war in 1953. You can see this picture here. A staff member is distributing supplies to Koreans to help in reconstruction efforts. We stayed engaged to help rebuild houses and hospitals and things like that in the South for about 5 years, and our contract ended with the UN. But we stayed engaged in the region in the decades that followed up until this day. And in the 1980s, the AFSC became the first US NGO to enter North Korea. And we did so out of concern, out of the fact that the war was still continuing and that there were still families searching for their loved ones. And we hoped to be a bridge for these families and the larger geopolitical context as well. That initial exchange essentially started off a very great partnership in which we would go to the North Korea and basically take part in professional exchanges, and we would bring North Koreans to the United States. And you can see this picture here in the middle, which is a staff member with North Koreans standing in Philadelphia in front of the Liberty Bell. It's a picture I think that probably is not one that folks see quite often, but it was pretty relatively commonplace in the 80s and 90s. And that was really important to build trust with our partners on the ground. And in the early or mid 90s, North Korea suffered a famine, and the trust that we had built over the years really paid off in that moment, because AFSC staff were some of the first that were shown the reality of the situation in North Korea and were told that North Koreans needed help. And our staff were able to return to the U.S. and to heed calls for the help and to initiate calls for the international community to send aid as well. In the wake of the famine, once things subsided a little bit, we realized with our partners that working on food security was an important aspect of this conflict, and it was one that we could help in the immediate term. And so we began working with 4 cooperative farms, working on conservation agricultural techniques. This is what we do today when there's not a pandemic. We have not been able to travel there since the pandemic, but we do normally go there about twice a year, and we visit our farms and we work on various techniques. You can see here is a picture of our partner as well as a staff member and a farmer in the background there, walking alongside this wall inside a greenhouse. And this is one of the techniques that we helped introduce, and it helped sort of basically heat the greenhouse in winter enough that they could grow even fruits and strawberries and things like that. So that's what we're up to today. And I think that some of this will make sense too as I go through some of the conflict history as well. Just quickly before I get into the conflict history, a reminder on the geography. I just want to point out that Korea is situated here in between 3 really big powers. China, Japan, and Russia here has an interest as well. And so I just want folks to keep that in mind as they think about this conflict, about where Korea is situated on the map. I'm going to begin my crash course in history with Japanese colonial rule, which sounds very far back, but I promise I'm going to try to be quick about this. And before I even get to the Japanese colonial rule, I want to point out that the US and Korea essentially had a mutual defense pact prior to Japanese colonial rule. However, the Japanese envoys actually pleaded with Theodore Roosevelt for basically the Americans to allow them to take over Korea. And Theodore Roosevelt, being sort of a Japan-phile, agreed. And when the Koreans pleaded for help, for the assistance from the U.S., they basically dismissed the pleas for help and essentially broke the mutual defense treaty. So that's an important fact and undergirds a lot of the history here. Japanese colonial rule was quite brutal, and I want to point out this cartoon here that came out in time, and I hope you can see my cursor here. But look at the focus of this cartoon. You can see that the focus is really on almost this staring contest between Russian and Japanese troops. And underneath here, you have the Koreans, almost as, it's not quite visible. And so you can see where people's mindset were at. It was great power competition and wasn't so focused on the folks who were caught in between, which would eventually come back to bite us all in the rear end. Japanese colonial rule was quite brutal. You can see these women lined up against a wall here. These women were unfortunately being forced into sex slavery. And this is something that still has a bearing on Japanese-Korea relations today. There are somewhat euphemistically referred to as comfort women, but I think that there are still quite a bit of grievances with regards to this, and some of these women are still alive today. And you can see images such as this one which propped up as early as, or as recently as 2019. So this is still a huge factor, and I think the Koreans are still sort of searching for real closure on this issue. And we can get more into that in the Q&A if folks are interested. And here we have a last picture here where this is a group of Koreans who were fighting Japanese rule. These were essentially guerrilla fighters. And in this picture is Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, if you know, is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. I don't know which one he is. I saw competing versions of captions here, so I won't venture a guess, but he is pictured here. And that's really important because he did have a certain cachet during Japanese colonial rule as being one of the leaders in the rebel movement to fight against colonial rule. Fast forwarding a little bit towards the end of World War II, the US came into possession of all Japanese holdings in Asia. And when it came to Korea, the US essentially decided it didn't have energy to put into sort of wrestling the USSR over who had control over it. They thought that if the US took over all of Korea, the USSR may get a little agitated at that. And so they essentially proposed to the USSR to split North Korea and South Korea. And the way that they did that was two US officers literally ripped a page out of the National Geographic magazine and drew an arbitrary line across the 38th parallel. They proposed that to the USSR and the USSR agreed. What's important here to note is that not one single Korean was consulted in this process. And often when I give this talk, somebody often says, well, the USSR was a part of this too. That's true. They did accept the agreement, but they did not propose it. The US proposed it. And I think it's also important to note that the USSR no longer exists. So it's important to note that the US has huge historical contributions here and essentially created North Korea. Today we call the Korean War the Forgotten War, but actually just to go back here, what we have here after the splitting of South and North Korea is huge tensions between the two countries. There was both competition between who was really the rightful owner of Korea and who was going to unify it. And importantly, in the North, Kim Il-sung was installed, and Kim Il-sung, as I mentioned, had some previous cachet as being a guerrilla fighter. In the South, Syngman Rhee was installed by the US, who was a pretty brutal dictator, but both had plans to invade one another. And there was a lot of tension and border skirmishes in the years that followed. That eventually broke out into war. I just want to point out this headline here that says Truman okays troops for action in Korea. This is something that still has a bearing today because it set legal precedent for the administration to take military action without seeking congressional approval. That had bearing in Vietnam and Afghanistan and other conflicts as well. Just quickly, you can look at this map. This is the trajectory of the war. I won't get too bogged down into the details, but you can see that this completely ravaged the entire peninsula here. What happened is that the North invaded, they came all the way down here. They got the South Koreans into this little sort of corner here. The US invaded from Incheon right here, and it worked. It pushed the North Koreans back all the way up north. The Chinese said if the US crossed the Yalu River, they would get involved. The US didn't believe them and crossed the river, and the Chinese did get involved and pushed them all the way back down to essentially the point where they had started the war to begin with. And it basically ended in a stalemate there. The result of this was complete, utter devastation of the peninsula. As I mentioned, you can see that the trajectory of the military conflict was huge. You can imagine what this did to families, to communities. It tore them apart. Absolutely, completely devastated the North. There were basically no bombing targets left, meaning that there were no standing buildings in the North at the end of the war. And it's also important to note that the US introduced other utensils of war, such as napalm, in the North. And this is not totally, this is something that the Koreans still remember. Upwards of 4 million people lost their lives, a huge conflict. And I think that it's really unfortunate that we call it the Forgotten War in the US because it's actually still going on. And it was a huge, huge conflict, I think, that is not really recognized in the US. Here we have the armistice signed, a newspaper from that time. And this is still where we are today, largely. The Korean War now in an uneasy truce. We are still in a state of war with North Korea because the armistice was signed. An armistice is a ceasefire, but a peace treaty was never negotiated. They did attempt once in the years that followed, and then basically in the decades that followed, they never reattempted negotiations. And so we are still in a state of war. If you note, there's an article here that says families fear double cross. I don't know what that article says, but you can imagine that there is a lot of family separation, and now there's fear and suspicion introduced as well. This is still something that we're dealing with today. The families are still seeking to reunite with loved ones, and this is something that the American Friends Service Committee still supports. It's important to note that a lot of these Koreans came to America as well, and Korean Americans are still trying to reunite with loved ones in the North as well. And this is very much an American issue. You can see this other headline here that says POW return due in a week. And this is still another issue that we're dealing with today. There are about 5,000 remains of POWs and MAIs still in North Korea. There were some successful operations to bring these remains home. And just to prove a point, I did a Google search last night to see if any remains had been identified. And sure enough, about every 2 weeks, remains of Korean soldiers are identified and sent home, and some families are able to get closure. A lot of these families are still seeking closure and still seeking for those operations to continue. Okay, I'm going to zoom through U.S. recent policy, and we can get more into the Q&A if there's interest here. What's important to note is that in 1994, the U.S. and North Korea signed a nuclear accord that froze North Korea's nuclear program. That fell apart in 2002 under the Bush administration, and again, we can get into reasons why in the Q&A if people are interested. Fast forwarding through the Obama administration, not much happened there, unfortunately. And then we get to Trump's sort of unusual diplomatic efforts with the North, which seemed to be a possibility for an opening to end the war and to resume nuclear negotiations, but things kind of fell apart. One of the things that did happen and that the AFSC was really supportive of is that they did get home the remains of 55 boxes of U.S. service members. And so I think that there were more members that were identified, but it was one of those actionable items. And so it still represents one of those important opportunities to help heal the wounds of war. We would really hope that the Biden administration pursues this as well. The Biden administration has unfortunately drawn a line and is not allowing South Korea to pursue an end of war declaration. I've heard that they're negotiating a text, but they're not going to issue the declaration. This is something that's really disappointing. It's quite unusual to me, quite remarkable that the U.S. feels it has the power to stop a Korean-led peace process. And again, if you can think about the colonial history that I just went through there, that thread is still very, very apparent. This conversation is starting to change a little bit in Washington in recent years. There was a recent letter written by Representative Brad Sherman, and about 24 House members signed on, calling for a formal end of the Korean War. And we've also seen pieces of legislation be introduced as well, and even one passed the House in 2019. And so this conversation is beginning to change a little bit. I know I'm running a little bit on time, short on time here. I just want to quickly highlight what this has done to humanitarian operations. In 2018, there was a Singapore summit. The U.S. and North Korea agreed to sort of improve relations. Immediately following that, the U.S. banned American aid groups from traveling to North Korea. That was the first time in AFSC's 40-year history that the U.S. stopped us from traveling to North Korea. And it made no sense to us whatsoever, because some of the longest standing relationships that existed on the ground were then basically stopped and interrupted. And that has huge bearings on the conflict as well. And in the winter, the U.S. did ease some travel restrictions on those traveling, on aid workers traveling to North Korea, which was great. However, sanctions still remain in place, which impede a lot of our work, and still impede to this day, even if the borders reopened on the North Korean side. And excuse me, I'm running really quick here because I know I'm low on time. Some suggested reading, I would please do read Visual Politics in North Korea. It's a very important book, a little pricey, get it at your library. The Korean War is one of my favorite references by Bruce Cummings. And I would say anyone who's remotely interested in Asia policy should please read The China Mirage. It's a really great book. And these are a couple articles I wrote, a little less important. So I'll wrap up. I know I'm short on time. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited, and I look forward to the continuing conversation here.
Thank you, Dan, for this excellent presentation that really, not only puts us into the history, but also gives us some sense of perhaps what our current responsibilities are that we can discuss later. Let me turn now to Susan Hammond to address the case of Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you for inviting me to this important conference. There's actually an interesting link between my organization and AFSC, because John McAuliffe, my former boss at the Fund for Reconciliation and Development, worked at AFSC during the shortly after the Vietnam War, and on normalizing relations with Vietnam and addressing war legacy issues in their program. And Roger Rumpf, who is the husband of Jackie Shenyang, who I work with in Laos, has worked on North Korean issues for AFSC as well. So there's a lot of links here. So I'm going to focus on what's happened on war legacy issues in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But it's important to remember that when we're talking about that war, that there was a trade embargo and a diplomatic embargo against all three countries for 20 years after the war. Actually, Laos, we had relations, but they were very much downgraded. So for the first 20 years since the end of the war, it was very difficult for organizations to be working in those countries. AFSC and the Mennonites were one of the few who were able to continue some work in the region. But it was not until the U.S. began discussions about MIA recovery missions in Vietnam in the late 1980s that collaboration on war legacy issues between the U.S. and Vietnam really began. And we have a huge round of thanks that needs to be given to Senator Patrick Leahy, who from early on worked to find ways to begin to address war legacy issues in Southeast Asia. In 1989, the Leahy War Victims Fund began to provide prosthetic devices to those impacted by unexploded ordnance and landmines in Vietnam, and later expanding this work to Cambodia and Laos. I'm very sad to see that Senator Leahy will be retiring next year, because he's been so vital in this work. These early efforts to address war legacy issues led the way for a step-by-step process to build a stronger bilateral relationship with the U.S. and its former enemies, and end the trade embargo. The end of the trade embargo and the diplomatic embargo in the mid-1990s allowed NGOs to really begin to push on a fully address some of these war legacy issues. And this is about when I began to start my work. We have to remember that more bombs were dropped on Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam during the U.S. war than in any other war, including World War II. Over 2.5 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos alone in over 580,000 bomb missions. Or as the NGO Legacies of War points out, that's the equivalent of a bomb every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years, making Laos the most bombed country per capita in the world. Bombing of Cambodia began as early as 1965, resulting in similar amounts of bombs dropped, mostly along the border region with Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese had their sanctuaries. The U.S. dropped, again, at least 3 million tons on Vietnam. Most impacted was the central part of the country where Haiti works, although all areas of the country of Vietnam were impacted, including extensive bombing in the north. On top of the bombing, Vietnam and Laos and parts of Cambodia were the target of over 20 million gallons of herbicides dropped by the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army Chemical Corps over the forests and around the perimeters of bases. Over 10,000 square miles of forest were destroyed in Vietnam, an area about the size of Massachusetts. In addition, over 640,000 acres of cropland were destroyed, an area the size of Rhode Island, in an effort to deny food to the enemy forces, though I'm not sure how the U.S. could tell the difference between civilian crops and enemy crops. The Ho Chi Minh Trail region in the south of Laos was also sprayed heavily, over 600,000 gallons in a short period of time. Since the war in Laos was done in secret, coordinated by the CIA, we still do not have a complete record of the herbicides used there, especially if and how much any perimeter spraying was done on former U.S. bases of operations such as Long Chen. The environmental destruction at the time was bad enough that Arthur Galston at Yale University coined the term ecocide to describe it. In addition to the lives that were lost and injuries caused during the war, the bombing caused huge infrastructure destruction, leveling villages. Civilians fled their villages and were forced to spend nearly 10 years in makeshift shelters or caves in the hills, able only to work in their fields when there was no bombing. There was a great deal of food insecurity. Lives were upended as children were unable to attend school. Families were unable to earn a living, and healthcare was devastated. The stress of war and malnutrition has been shown to have long-term epigenetic impacts on future generations in studies done on those who suffered famine in the Netherlands during World War II. One can only imagine the impacts of the people of Southeast Asia after more than a decade of war, or for that matter, on those in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere we have waged war. Nearly 50 years since the end of the war, much has changed. Today, the majority of the population were not even born until after the war ended. Prior to COVID, their economies were some of the fastest growing in Southeast Asia. On the surface, it would appear that the war was long over. However, the hardships and stress of years of war has long-term impacts on the people and the economies of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, especially in the countryside. But for those who live in the areas that were heavily bombed or sprayed by herbicides, their daily lives are still impacted by the war. Up to a third of the cluster munitions dropped did not explode. In Laos alone, there are over 80 million unexploded bombs, still capable of causing severe injury or death more than 50 years later. Since the end of the war, Vietnam unexploded ordnance has resulted in over 100,000 casualties, including nearly 40,000 deaths. Cambodia, where landmines are also a large issue, has seen at least 65,000 casualties, with nearly 20,000 deaths. And in Laos, with a population of only around 6 million people, there have been over 50,000 casualties, with nearly 30,000 deaths. That's 1 in 120 people in Laos who have been personally impacted by UXOs. Of course, accidents and injuries do not impact just the victim, but their families as well. And again, thanks to the work of Senator Leahy, the U.S. has been working to help Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to mitigate the impacts of explosive remnants of war. Since 1993, the U.S. has provided over $500 million to help remove UXO and to provide assistance to their victims. However, to put this into perspective, that's approximately the cost of 5 days of waging the Vietnam War. Nonetheless, this funding has been essential to provide medical care, prosthetics, rehabilitation, and vocational training to victims, as well as to conduct mine risk education programs for school children so they learn not to pick up those small bombies that look like a little tennis ball. Much of this funding has also been used to clear villages and farmlands of UXOs so people can move on with their lives. However, much more is needed to be done. The Lao government, for instance, estimates that only about 1% of the UXO contaminated land has been cleared. While it takes centuries to clear it all, we're still finding bombs from World War I, for instance, in Europe. However, more funding is needed to ensure that people of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia are able to walk to school, to farm, build a home, to start a fire without the threat of a UXO explosion. In comparison, the U.S. has provided over $500 million each to Iraq and Afghanistan for ERW, or explosive remnants of war. So it's good to see that they are responding to the crisis much earlier than in Southeast Asia. I have been working since the late 1990s to address the other legacy of war, the ongoing health and environmental impacts of Agent Orange. Over 12 million gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed over Vietnam, Laos, and parts of Cambodia. However, Agent Orange was contaminated with dioxin during the manufacturing process by the chemical companies who produced the herbicides at herbicide 2,4,5-T, which is half of Agent Orange, too quickly and at too high a temperature. Dioxin is a known human carcinogen, is linked to by the VA to more than 18 cancers, illnesses, and conditions, including Parkinson's disease, which contributed to my father's death 6 years ago. We have found that in our work in Vietnam and Laos that there are greater numbers of people with birth defects, including those that cause severe disabilities in the areas that were heavily sprayed. While the VA does not provide support to children of veterans with birth defects, unless they have spina bifida, it does recognize this for male veterans, I should say. The 18 does recognize 18 birth defects in the offspring of female veterans for their service in Vietnam, though not specifically for Agent Orange. The Vietnamese government recognizes these same birth defects, as well as many others, as being associated to Agent Orange. Starting shortly after the normalization of relations with Vietnam, I and others have been advocating for the U.S. to address the ongoing impacts of Agent Orange in Vietnam. I currently am doing the same in Laos. This has been an uphill struggle, as in the beginning, the US refused to even acknowledge that there was any impacts in Vietnam. But thanks to the work of Lady Borton at AFSC, US veteran Chuck Searcy, the Vietnam Veterans of America, Hatfield Group in Canada, the Ford Foundation under the leadership of Charles Bailey, and others that I've had the privilege to work with over the years, we've been able to break through the political bottleneck that has held back progress on this issue. It was not easy, and there were some very dark days when progress was at a standstill. On the environmental side of the issue, Hatfield was able to show that the areas that were sprayed by Agent Orange are no longer highly contaminated with dioxin. However, the areas where the herbicides were loaded onto planes are dioxin hotspots that would be considered Superfund sites if they were here in the US. This opened the door for the US to begin to work with the Vietnamese on this issue, when it was determined that the contamination was limited to a handful of US bases in Vietnam. In 2006, on a visit to Vietnam, President Bush and Vietnam President Triet released a joint statement that in essence said working together to address Agent Orange would contribute to the further development of bilateral relations. This opened the door for the first appropriation of funding from, again, through Senator Leahy's office, for the US to address Agent Orange in Vietnam, of $3 million that was funded in 2008. For the past 10 years, the US and Vietnam have been working together to clean up the dioxin contamination at the Da Nang and Bien Hoa air bases, which is where the bulk of the Agent Orange was stored and loaded onto planes. The Da Nang base was completed in 2018, and the Bien Hoa base started shortly after that. Over $340 million has been allocated by the US since 2001 for this dioxin remediation work. Interestingly, the Bien Hoa base is also not just funded through the State Department's budget, but $15 million a year has been committed for over a period of 10 years has been committed by the Pentagon for this cleanup. However, when it comes to the assistance to those who have been impacted by Agent Orange, it gets to be a bit more complicated. Unlike UXO, it is harder to prove you're a victim of Agent Orange. Since there appears to be more people with birth defects and severe disabilities in the area that was sprayed, U.S. assistance is now targeted to assist those individuals with severe upper and lower body mobility impairment or cognitive development disabilities in the areas that were sprayed with herbicides. In the fiscal year 2021, the appropriation totaled about $14.5 million to support those with disabilities in the Agent Orange impacted areas, bringing the total contribution from the U.S. since 2011 to over $93 million for disability services. However, this funding only supports a small fraction of those considered to be victims of Agent Orange, who are reached by the 9 foreign and domestic NGOs who've received the USAID funding. Most programs do not reach those in the more rural areas of Vietnam, where a child who has a disability so severe they need round-the-clock care, and that this puts an incredible strain on a family. Those families caring for children with disabilities are the poorest of the poor in Vietnam. And to date, no U.S. funding reaches those families just across the border in Laos who have children with disabilities, believed to be impacted by Agent Orange. These are the families that my organization works with in Vietnam. While there are some that benefit from the medical care and prosthetic devices, most are children with disabilities that are so severe there is little medically that can be done, or it's too late for any intervention. We therefore focus on helping the families by providing direct assistance in the form of livelihood support, home repairs, scholarships for their siblings, who will one day be their caregivers when their parents die. Much of our work in Vietnam is funded by the family and friends of a U.S. veteran named Bob Feldman, who died from lymphoma linked to his exposure to Agent Orange in Bien Hoa. In Laos, we work with those who live in the villages along the Ho Chi Minh Trail near the border with Vietnam that were heavily sprayed. However, in Laos, more of our work is helping to provide medical care, life-saving or life-changing surgery for birth defects such as clubbed foot, cleft lip, cleft palate, that would have been addressed shortly after birth if that child lived in Vietnam or even in Vientiane. Until very recently, it was very difficult to travel to these remote mountain villages as there was little or no road access. Most families did not know that medical procedures were even possible to address some of these conditions. Even if they were to go for medical care, these subsistence farmers do not have access to cash needed to travel from their villages to the province or national capital. Most are ethnic minorities who have limited Lao language skills. My colleague Nipapon in Laos works closely with these families to help their children access the medical care they need to live healthy lives and to be able to integrate into their communities. This is some of the most important work that my organization does. I think of young Ban, who had such severe clubfoot in both feet that he was unable to walk. He was not able to attend school with his friends, and therefore not able to access the nutrition programs that the US government provides. His father stayed with Ban in Vientiane for months so that he could undergo surgery on both legs. When I last saw Ban in 2019, he was running around the soccer field with his friends. You would not even know he was born with a severe disability if you met him today. I also think of Yen, whose mother wanted her to die when she was a child due to her severe joint disorder, a condition called arthrogryposis, that made it very difficult for Yen to walk or use her hands. We were able to get Yen from her village to Vientiane for a series of surgeries and rehabilitation to improve her functioning, but she's still severely impacted physically. She enrolled in vocational training school, where she not only learned a trade, but it helped her to develop her confidence and independence. She now lives in Vientiane with a very loving husband. She's come a long way from her village, where she was severely malnourished and likely to die before her 16th birthday. Sadly, 9 children we've identified in our surveys in over 100 villages in Laos have already died from their disabilities. So it's important to get services there as soon as possible. These are just 2 examples of how we can change lives with the right support and resources. We are working with Senator Leahy's office to encourage the US government to support programs in Laos to help others like Yen and Ban, and hope that this can be achieved soon. Unlike Vietnam, where testing for hotspots has been conducted for many decades, this has not been done in Laos. So we're also hoping funding will allow for that to happen, so Laos can be certain that the dioxin is not going to impact future generations. So while we have come a long way since I first began to work more than 25 years ago, the job is far from complete. I just hope that we learn from the efforts to address war legacies in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and not make these same mistakes in Afghanistan and Iraq. At least on addressing explosive remnants of war, this seems to be the case. But wars have so many other long-term impacts on the nation and its people. The US needs to invest more than a small fraction of what it costs to wage war in order to address the impacts. It's not the only essential for the post-war recovery of the people and nations where we wage these wars, but it is vital for long-term security for the US to make peace with former enemies. Working together to address war legacies, even those as challenging as Agent Orange, has proven to be a successful way to do just that. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for taking us through a multi-generational cost of the war in the American war in Vietnam and its impact on the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and for your tireless efforts to deal with this. Let's see if we have learned some of the lessons of Vietnam with respect to impact on the population. I think we will hear now from Heidi Kuhn about her efforts to deal with the remnants of war in Afghanistan. Heidi, the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Linda, so much. It is such a great honor to be speaking at this very distinguished panel, and I'm so deeply inspired by Susan and Dan's story. I think it all begins with pivotal moments in our life. From my journey, in the 1970s, I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, and the Vietnam War was waging. Whether our cousins, brothers, sisters fought in the war, rejected the war, it defined our generation. And the legacy of war, as Susan said, are the remnants of war, explosive remnants of war left behind. And I'm so honored to work with her with War Legacies Group. We have, with Roots of Peace, worked in Quang Tri province, where 80% of the land today is still riddled with unexplosive ordnance, especially the cluster munitions and the other explosive that render the farmland unusable. And with Roots of Peace, let me share with you, these are landmines. This is an explosive remnant of war buried in the ground long after the guns of war have silenced. And as we remove these landmines, the land is no longer held hostage by these explosive.
Video, Heidi, could you put on your video? Sorry.
Excuse me. Okay, excuse me. Thank you so much. Well, again, I just want to say thank you so much, Linda, for inviting me, and the inspirational stories by both Susan and Dan, and just to, again, why we get into the work we do, why this strikes a passion in our hearts. And as a graduate of UC Berkeley in the 1970s, majoring in political economics of industrial societies, I watched as a teenager from afar the Vietnam War and those who came back, who not only suffered from having stepped on landmines, but the emotional scars from within. This is the example of a landmine. When planted in the ground, the grass grows, and these hidden remnants of war, such as this anti-personnel landmine, is planted in the soil. And long after the guns have silenced from war, the tender footstep of a child or a farmer, rendering his farmland, is at risk to the legacy of war that we left behind. Many of you will recognize this as a bouncing Betty. Once again, when 8 pounds of pressure is placed on this, when it's released, it will fragment in all directions. We live in a world today where there's an estimated 60 million landmines silently poised in 60 countries. Now, my background, having come from Berkeley, I went on to actually Alaska, and I was the CNN reporter for the melting of the ice curtain between US-Soviet relations and, of course, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. This was quite some time ago in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But again, I saw the opportunities to bridge borders among former enemies. So I went over there to Vladivostok, Sakhalin, Khabarovsk, and was actually there in the room at the Supreme Soviet when the announcement came that Andrei Sakharov had just died. I had the exclusive story with Gennady Gerasimov, and the story went viral. It opened up doors for me to, again, be a bridge of borders for peace among nations that are typical enemies. Life happens, and at 30 years old, I was diagnosed with 4th stage malignant cancer. And when I had a 1, 3, and 5-year-old looking into my children's eyes, I think anyone who goes through the knife, you make a defining promise that you will do something given the gift of life. Well, today I've more than doubled that life. And in 1997, following the tragic death of the late Princess Diana, I learned that, again, we live in a world where 60 million landmines are silently poised in the skin of Mother Earth. And I thought, for me personally, cancer is a landmine, and landmines are a cancer to the earth. And for me, the solution was quite clear: removal. And so in September 1997, with the vision from the heart of my home and taking those footsteps to the world, that the world may go from mines to vines, removing these seeds of hatred from the one earth that we share. But that's only half the problem. We needed to plant the agricultural roots on this land, again, that was held hostage by the scourge of landmines. So in January, the first month of the new millennium, I chose to take my footsteps to Croatia, where following the Balkan War, there were an estimated 1.2 million landmines silently poised. And with the support of the California vintners, who, yes, joined me without a penny to my name, we went up to Ottawa to witness the signing of the Ottawa Treaty to ban landmines. Robert Mondavi, Torcan Word of Behringer, and Eric Wente went. Again, without a political purpose, but respecting the plight of farmers around the world who strive to cultivate a harvest with the fear of landmines beneath their plow. That grew several months later to a launch in San Francisco, where a true story of civil society, and again, from me, from very humble beginnings, working from my heart on this project. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, as well as his lovely wife, Nana Non, and to my right was my Congresswoman. Over the years, her star rose from Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi to the first ever Speaker of the House. And when I said I wanted to turn mines to vines, she told me, I will be with you on this journey for as long as it takes. Well, after we worked hard and removed those explosive remnants of war, again, 1.2 million landmines in Croatia, I have seen with my own eyes the removal of landmines in Vukovar, Ilok, Čestamale, Čestavelika, Bibine, and Baštica. And today, it's one of the top tourist destinations in the world. So when people tell me peace is impossible, I look and I think of Croatia in January 2000, and where today we have the privilege to bring our families with tourism. Well, let's parlay now over to Afghanistan, because a year later, on September 11th, 2001, the world learned of Afghanistan. And with the attacks on the United States of America, I thought of Afghanistan in a different light. I learned Afghanistan is the most heavily mined country in the world. At that time, an estimated 10 million landmines silently poised in Afghanistan. However, conversely, in contrast to the images of Tora Bora and caves and hunting of bin Laden, Afghanistan is a country 80% dependent upon agriculture for jobs. So you have a country that was once dubbed the Garden of Central Asia, and conversely, the landmines prevent the cultivation of peace for over 40 years. So we set out on another quest to eradicate landmines halfway across the world. So many people told me it is impossible for you to do this. You are just a Marin County housewife. Give it up. Anybody who knows me, I don't do that very, very, very well. I tried even harder. And I went again to those vintners, and a very humble woman named Diane Miller offered to assist. She owns Silverado Vineyards, and she came to my world headquarters in the basement of my home with 4 children, and week after week helped me with that vision of turning mines to vines. One day, she took me to lunch and said, somebody's got to do this. There's 70 varietals of grapes in Afghanistan, and we need to remove those mines. It's called a Mickey. She wrote me a check. It was $200,000. Now, when you're in the basement seeking pennies for peace, that type of check to turn vision into reality was catalytic. She told me, she said, this is passion. I grew up with it. My father, it took 330 no's for him to convince the world that a mouse with ears would change it. You remind me of Dad. I was stunned. I was confused. I said, who was your father, Mrs. Miller? And very humbly, she said, my father was Walt Disney. And he had a vision, and the amount of no's it took him to achieve his dream is something that will one day lift you out of the basement. So it began in 2003 with the eradication of landmines and our partnership with the United Nations Mine Action Service under the leadership of Martin Barber. And then we partnered with the Halo Trust. And there, north of Kabul, in these beautiful Shamali plains, much like the Napa Valley, we removed over 100,000 landmines, UXOs, and cluster munitions. But that was only half, again, the problem, because the agricultural knowledge from grandfather to father to son was lost to war. And so we had to go back and train these farmers how to cultivate peace from the ground up. We started with a demonstration plot in Mirbo-Chakot, and we introduced the trellis grapevines. Now, if you've seen Napa, Sonoma County, there's these wooden posts. We introduced the wooden posts because the grapes were being harvested at midday on burlap sacks dragged to market in the heat of the day, where the farmers hoped to reap a meager profit. After we introduced the wooden posts, we told them to wait, be patient. We have an American idea. Well, I learned my first lesson that you listen to people, you do not impose your American idea. You listen to those with the needs in the countries from which they work. For in the spring, they had cut down all of the wooden posts. And when I innocently asked with my husband, Gary, why did you do this? And they looked blankly and said, Mrs. Kuhn, it was the coldest winter on record. If we didn't cut the wooden post down to heat our rooms and to warm the food to feed our children, we would have died. So we introduced the cement trellis posts, and that became a business model throughout all 16 provinces where grapes grew in Afghanistan. So we expanded that model, again, from mines to vines, and working in all 34 provinces, again, respecting the fact and demographics that Afghanistan is a country 80% dependent upon agriculture for jobs. So we started planting the pomegranates in Kandahar, the melons in Helmand, in the grapes and north of Kabul in the Shamali plains, apples, apricots, almonds in Ghazni, Wardak, Logar. We introduced cherries in Badakhshan, and over to the west, the beautiful saffron that comes from Herat. And suddenly Afghanistan began to bloom. It took patience, because when a seed is planted, it takes sunlight, water, and a human hand, and to nurture that vine so that it grows. And within a decade, Roots of Peace had planted, with funding from USAID, DOD, European Union, Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank, over 6 million fruit trees in all 34 provinces. And we went furthermore. We introduced the first cold storage refrigeration unit because, again, dragging these fresh fruits to market locally and expecting a meager income is not the way to lift up a nation that has such agricultural potential. So we introduced the cold storage refrigerations. We trained the farmers in sanitary conditions to sort the apples in similar size, pack them in corrugated boxes, brand them Afghan sweet fruits, because oftentimes they were just exported to Pakistan or neighboring markets who took the branding of this incredible agricultural economy away from them. When the neighboring markets started hearing of the fresh fruits that were back, those in the 1940s had learned of Afghanistan. They had a fabled trader called the Kabuliwalas, and they were so grateful that those Kabuliwalas from the 1960s and 70s were back to bring the best fruits in the world to be sold in India, Pakistan, UAE, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. And so what we did is, again, another innovative practice. We brought the agricultural traders to Gulf Food in Dubai. And we introduced them to the supermarket chains, Reliance, Big Bazaar, supermarkets in India, the third largest economy in the world, supply and demand. The supply of the beautiful Afghan fruits, vegetables, nuts, and spices, and the demand in the supermarkets to feed a middle-class economy. Again, the stereotypes sometimes that we have in the United States from very educated people think India is just still people begging on the streets and Afghanistan is all caves. Well, we have to learn a little bit more about, as Americans, and we have to learn the business of peace, the economics of peace. We've had challenges along the way, yes. On March 28th, 2014, one of the worst days of my life, I received from our team the notification that we were under attack by the Taliban. It was a 4.5-hour gun battle. And there are no winners in something like that, let me just tell you. But somehow, in a miraculous way, 5 Afghan Taliban fought our employees, 5 Afghan guards, and our 5 Afghan expats were trapped inside the same facility where I had stayed with my husband just a few weeks before. Well, it was rather than quit, it was a defining moment, and we decided to go the distance. And I'm so grateful to, again, the support that we received from USAID, from our CHAMP program, the Commercial Horticultural Agricultural Marketing Program. That's a mouthful. We called it CHAMP, but we took with our partners agricultural exports from, in 2014, from $250 million up to $1.4 billion. Now, that is the economics of peace. Those monies go back to the local farmers in all 34 provinces. And the farmers, quite frankly, have the dignity, they have the hope, and the abundance of the land that without landmines, UXOs and cluster munitions, have still the ability to reap a harvest of hope. Well, as we all know, this past harvest season was the most challenging for me in my entire professional career. In the midst of the harvest on August 15th, we all know there was this change of a regime, let's say that diplomatically, but you don't stop a harvest due to the change of a flag. And after much discussion and again, much thought, we stood with the Afghan people. And today I am very proud to say we maintain and employ 360 Afghans with funding from USAID, $30 million, and funding from the U.S. Department of State, INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, for we created alternative agricultural crops to poppies. An Afghan farmer growing a low-value crop such as wheat will earn $800 per year, growing poppies, $1,200, and growing high-value crops such as pomegranates and grapes for export, $4,000. Now, because of the OFAC laws and the new world that we live in as nonprofit organizations, and again, a woman-led CEO of an American NGO, I have to tiptoe right now in terms of the political landmines that are out there restricting the work we have on the ground. We cannot support exports because that benefits the new regime. But we are doing workarounds in illicit ways to sell those fresh fruits among the various provinces so that people have the ability to eat, and the farmers will reap the profit on the investment that they made, and really truly have sustainable peace as an outcome of the past 20 years, where Roots of Peace has managed over $200 million in international funding to empower the farmers and the families to reap a harvest of hope. It's the waning days right now of the harvest season, and we're so proud that 20% increase has occurred throughout all the provinces, despite the political landmines that the world has endured. And I hope that the world may find ways, as Dan and Susan said, to somehow make friends with our enemies. Because if we ignore 97% unemployment right now, 97% in Afghanistan, the harsh winter months are ahead, and the innocent Afghan people who have already suffered so much in the past 43 years. This is personal to me. These are my friends. These are not just my employees. And I stand in solidarity with the Afghan people, again, to further invest in this economic engine so that we can put the greenhouses in. We can immediately put in the trellis, again, the cement trellises, because the grapes have all been picked. But if we wait weeks for peace treaties to be signed, you can't put those trellis posts into frozen snow. It's just the how agriculture works. And so I guess in my closing remarks, peace treaties don't wait. Nature doesn't wait for peace treaties to be signed. We are in the midst of a harvest of hope, and we do need to be there for the Afghan people, continue that investment in peace, and help, again, turn swords into plowshares, guns into shovels, and with the 400,000 Afghan soldiers who have lost their job, on the 30th of August, lost their jobs, well trained by the US military, but they have families. It's winter. We either allow other forces to come in and hire these strong young men, or we train them to become farmers. We give them vocational training, and we do it urgently. We have the infrastructure of Roots of Peace and the respect of the farmers, having worked in all 34 provinces. Again, we carry no flag. We serve the farmer, and whatever Roots of Peace can do to help Afghanistan lift itself from this catastrophe. And again, very sadly, in the weeks and months to come, we will see massive starvation and further pain that I believe the Afghan people do not deserve to suffer. There are solutions, and thank you so much, Linda. I'm slightly passionate about this subject because we are working with our team here in San Rafael, California, 24/7, and many of them are Afghans with their families who are stuck over there right now and living a nightmare. So thank you, Linda. Thank you so much to the Georgetown University and to my colleagues for their inspiration and a beautiful way to begin a week leading to a true Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for this inspiring description of your starting points and your constant dedication to establishing Roots of Peace. I'd like to, we'll have some questions from the attendees, but I'd like to start off with going back to something that Dan alluded to or spoke about, and that is that when we look at these wars, we see that the U.S. administration of the various governments went ahead and launched military actions without necessarily consulting Congress or obtaining declarations of war and so forth. So nevertheless, we do inhabit, those of us who are Americans, not everyone I expect on this call is, we are citizens of a democracy. So I would like to know what each of you would recommend your fellow citizens to do to heal the wounds of war that were launched in our name. Dan, what are some concrete actions that you expect, that you would like attendees to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I spend a lot of my time doing advocacy work, so this is something I think about quite frequently. I would really encourage folks to get in touch with their members of Congress to take back some oversight control over our military involvement overseas. With respect to the Korean War, we do have, I think I mentioned a bill in Congress currently. It's called the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. It's actually the first bill to mention ending the Korean War. And I would really encourage participants to reach out to their members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, to sign on to this bill and to try to move it through. It would be amazing, I think, if it actually passed. We have a couple hurdles to get past, but I think it's really important that members of Congress hear from citizens, because I often hear from staffers that say, this makes sense, but we don't really hear from our constituency very often on this. So the more you can communicate to your members of Congress on this, the better, in my opinion.
Thank you, Dan. Susan? Oops, you're muted. That's
Sorry.
a refrain with all meetings.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, we really need to be in touch with our congressional leaders, and also just really stress that, we've got to, as I said in my remarks, we have to start spending more resources on addressing the after the after effects of war and the impacts it has, because that is vitally urgent, as Heidi stressed, in security, so that we can avoid future wars. We've got to address really what, these fractured relationships we've had and the impacts on the people these wars have caused.
Is there any particular legislation that you see on the horizon that our Congress people should be aware of?
Well, there's always the appropriations cycle that, the funding that goes to USAID for Heidi's work. We don't receive USAID funding, but I think it's important to let our legislators know we think funding through these USAID programs is essential. And they, then and focus on particular areas of the world that you care about as well, to make sure that funding gets there. I mean, a lot of us who work in this area are a little, though I knew Senator Leahy was considering not running again, it was really devastating to hear that news this week that he will not be running in next year, because he has been the one who's really pushed for this funding for post-war issues. And he's obviously very senior. He's been in the Senate since 1974. So he has a strong voice, and we really need to develop relationships with other members of Congress and really stress the need to continue the legacy that Leahy created.
Thank you, Susan. What about you, Heidi?
Well, Linda, I agree with my colleagues. Yes, it's essential that we reach out to members of Senate and Congress and write op-eds. I would like to invite everybody on this call and virtually. December 2nd marks the 24th anniversary of the signing of the Ottawa Treaty to ban landmines, and Roots of Peace will be hosting a virtual event, what we call our Roots of Peace Global Citizen Awards. Senator Patrick Leahy was a past recipient, as well as Speaker Pelosi. But this year we'll be honoring Jane Goodall because of the impact of landmines on animals. She will be a speaker. Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, President Emeritus of the World Food Prize, who was an advocate of the eradication of landmines when he served as ambassador to Cambodia. Ambassador Ashraf Haidari, who is the Afghan ambassador in Sri Lanka, talking about the situation, keeping those voices alive. And of course, Tracy Wataski, who is the ABC 7 news anchor, actually news director, the vice president. And she has covered stories following us to Afghanistan, Vietnam, Israel, Palestine, to cover landmines. We don't have landmines in California. We can hike the mountains, run the beaches without the fear. And I really credit the leadership of the media to keep a light on this, because otherwise, I guarantee you, with Afghanistan, it will fade and dissipate. And we need to evacuate also the at-risk women, which I did not mention, 38 who were left at the Hamid Karzai International Airport. Their names were given to the Taliban. And again, as a woman-led CEO of an American NGO, I feel a personal responsibility to help these women. Again, we have to amplify their voices, because they will be squashed out, and kumbaya, we just go on. Not acceptable.
Well, thank you for these comments and marching orders, I might say. I have a comment from Mike Burton, which perhaps calls for your comments. This is probably pie in the sky, but the U.S. violated the 1962 Geneva Accord and for 9 years bombed Laos. The government of Laos should sue the United States in the International Court for War Reparations. Do you have any comment on that idea? Susan, perhaps?
I can comment. Dan may know more, but well, I mean, for one, we're not a member of the International Criminal Court, so that makes that very difficult right there to sue the U.S. government. But that has been raised by others, and also the impacts of Agent Orange. as the Lao possibly suing for that, though. At least in the Agent Orange side of the story, courts have ruled, including French courts, have ruled that you can't sue the chemical companies for the dioxin that was in the Agent Orange, because you can't. They were government contractors. So I think, I mean, I don't know enough about the bombing in, how you would get a case together for the bombing in Laos, but it just seems like it would be very much, as mentioned, a pie in the sky ability to do that. There was a paper someone wrote about it, I'd say about 15 years ago. So if I can dig that up, I'll send it to Mike.
So I trying to pardon me, I'm having Rebecca, could you please post again the Q&A question that you had further? I'm trying to find it. Yeah, so one of our attendees asks, gosh. Sorry, Rebecca, I can't see it again. Boy, forgive me here.
I can see them here. Were you talking about the one to Dan?
Yes, would you mind reading it? I can't see
Sure.
it up for some reason. Thank
Yeah,
you, Susan.
You mentioned a newspaper article about U.S. Democrats urging President Biden to formally end the Korean War. It's my understanding there are still matters that need to be settled before ending the war, such as North Korea's nuclear disarmament and addressing humanitarian issues. That being said, what is the way that the United States pursues for ending the war, and how may this be accepted to U.S. Korean citizens? Would it agree with the ways South Korea and North Korea pursue?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I won't go into too much detail because it gets a little complicated quickly. But I think the point here about the legislation is that it's encouraging the State Department to enter into negotiations to formally end the war. It doesn't prescribe necessarily a sequence of events. From AFSC's perspective, I think it's important to note, and that's kind of why I went through some of the history here, is that the unended war is one of the reasons, it is the reason why North Korea is acquiring nuclear weapons to begin with. This unended state of war is quite palpable in North Korea. And I should have talked about this a little bit more, but we do go there. And when you enter North Korea, the state of war is extremely evident. You feel like the country is under siege. And actually, I've been to the DMZ multiple times from both the South and the North. And from the North, when our partners took us there, they pointed to the three flags across the border, which was the UN, the US, and South Korea. And they said, do you see why we think the world is against us? And I think that was a really powerful moment for me to understand what their mindset was. And so I think from our perspective is that we have to end the war in order to get into a place of arms control, because as it stands right now, we're essentially saying to the North Koreans, well, we'll end the war when you surrender and give us all your weapons. It's not a very effective negotiating strategy, and I don't think the North Koreans really buy it. So with respect to the bill, I will say that it doesn't prescribe a sequence of events. And it is meant to, I think, buttress the efforts that are coming out of South Korea right now, which are trying to end the war formally. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Is there another question from the audience?
Yeah, there's one from Paul Lee, or from Paul.
Oh,
It
I
says
think
Dan
that's the
Jet.
same one.
You see that one? It's in the chat now.
Isn't that the same one that we just had?
No. Dan
Okay,
mentions
sorry.
that many U.S. citizens, Korean Americans, remain separated from their family members in North Korea. Do the speakers know if any family separation was common between Vietnamese Americans refugees and their family members in Vietnam? Were there restrictions on travel, remittance remittances, I can't say that word, phone, mail, communication, and other forms of exchange before U.S. Vietnam diplomatic normalization of relations in 95. And so how did the normalization address these divisions? So yeah, it was very, in the immediate aftermath of the war. Of course, I mean, I would suggest reading the work of Ivan Small, who happens to be on my board, but he's a professor at University of Central Connecticut, who has written on this topic of the remittances, like why can't I say that? The funding going back to family members in Vietnam. He's written a lot about that, but it was very difficult after the first phase of the war in the late 70s and early 80s. At that point, most people were leaving Vietnam and coming to the U.S. They weren't quite yet going back, but there were workarounds, as with anything. There was a way to send money to someone here in the U.S. who would find a way to get it to a business in Vietnam, who would then get it to their families. So there was a Vietnamese way to do it. And people were able to start to go back to Vietnam even before the full normalization of relations. Technically, it said in your passport that you were violating the law by traveling into Vietnam at that time. But people who had the ability to do that were starting to go back. But it really was not until after normalization of relations that you saw more Vietnamese Americans reuniting with their families, and young Vietnamese Americans going over to Vietnam and set up businesses there.
Thank you, Susan, for bringing up to light the fact that even though the war came to the conflict came to an end in 1975, the whole period before reconciliation and reestablishment of diplomatic relations was in some ways a war of other means on the Vietnamese people.
Yeah, and there was a lot of efforts also to bring people from Vietnam who worked for the Americans, who were children of Vietnam American fathers out of Vietnam before normalization of relations. So there's been quite a lot written about that. That if you do a nice Google search, you'll come up with some good background books and studies on that.
Are there any other questions? I believe someone had their hand up on the reactions. Let's see. Well, I see Miriam Thompson. Sorry, if Miriam has a question, please put it in the Q&A so I'll be able to see it.
Linda, I'm commenting, if I may, on one that was sent to me privately
Okay.
about Vietnam. And Susan, again, we're working not in competition and collaboration because Agent Orange and, of course, the explosive Landmine civil war left behind affect entire communities. But Roots of Peace is currently, again, working in partnership with MAG, the Mines Advisory Group, to eradicate the unexploded ordnance, primarily the cluster munitions. But we've trained 10,000 Vietnamese farmers to grow black pepper on the former minefields. And the best black pepper, just like there's, best grapes in the world, the best black pepper in the world actually comes from Quang Tri. And furthermore, we're exporting that black pepper and we're selling it to Morton and Bassett Spice Company in Sonoma County. It's one of the largest spice companies in the United States. They're putting a little logo of Roots of Peace on every single bottle. and selling it. And then a percentage of the proceeds goes back to those rural communities. And again, those who fought and know about the Vietnam War. It's in places like in Quang Tri, Khe Sanh, Cam Lo, Dong Ha, places that were certainly battlefields, but they're now producing some of the best black pepper in the world. So it's a real great business model. Shout out for Mines to Vines. And many of those young women actually have given birth to children who suffer from Agent Orange. It gets them out of the house to become proud farmers and have money. Many of the men have left them because these children are so severely deformed. So it's a whole value chain. It's not silos we're working in. We're working in strong collaboration with one another. And Susan, so deeply respect what you've done.
So true. It's really important to see that there's such a synergy between those organizations working on humanitarian efforts in former conflict zones need to work together to make sure that they have access, that they have support from funding organizations, and certainly raise awareness for the whole population that is concerned with healing the remnants of war. We're coming close to our final minutes of this conference, so I'd like to turn back to each of you to give some your own concluding remarks, having heard from each other, and perhaps also feel free to give us whatever guidance you see as we move forward, accepting the responsibility of knowing now what we know about the history and the impacts of 70 years of war. So let me turn to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the comments from my fellow panelists here. It's really, really inspiring to be alongside you all. I'll just make two quick comments. One comment is regards to landmines. And I didn't cover this issue in terms of Korea, but it is still an ongoing issue in Korea as well. And prior to the Trump administration, it's worth noting that the US had what's called the Korea exception, which it was basically the US could only deploy and have landmines in Korea. And so the DMZ, the line that separates South and North Korea, is heavily, heavily mined. And oftentimes it rains and those mines slide out and farmers get caught. And this is still a huge issue. It also, as Heidi and Susan have pointed out, represents a really important exercise at building peace, because this is something that both sides can come together on to demine the DMZ and to turn it back into an ecological sort of preservation area. Also, just want to quickly comment on Miriam Thompson's question here. I think I see it here in the chat. She asked about ways, excuse me, in which we can address actions that confront the military-industrial congressional complex. And I appreciate that she had the full sort of sentence there. I just want to quickly say that, I don't mean to sort of hound on this point, but I think it's so important to be raising these issues to your members of Congress, to doing traditional forms of advocacy, writing op-eds, talking about how the military budget takes away from human security and needs that we have here at home and our own infrastructure. And I think increasingly now climate resilience. It's really important for you to be active and to just be loud as possible. I also think that there is a time and place for demonstrations in the street, and I think we're at that point. So if you can organize outside, that's also very beneficial. Thank you so much for inviting me, Linda, and fellow.
Thank you, Dan. Very important advice. Thank you again. Susan?
Yes, thank you. And it was great to be a part of this event this morning. And I'm glad that Dan answered Miriam's question, because AFSC and then FCNL down in Washington have been really important in making sure that those issues of the military industrial complex are raised, because it has huge impacts internationally, but also domestically, as so much of our money goes into the Pentagon budget. And here we're fighting over, funding to help people have family leave, and we can't find the money for that, but we have no problem funding military efforts. I also want to stress again the importance of telling the story and enabling, as Heidi mentioned, people to tell their own story and get that out there. Because Americans, our attention span is pretty small. But we were lucky enough earlier this year in March to have George Black profile a lot of our work in Laos in the New York Times Magazine article. And I got just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments from people who read that article who had no idea about the impact of the war in Laos. They didn't. Many people may not even remember where Laos is or know where it was. So it's very important to keep telling these stories, and I can't stress enough to let your elected officials know. Ask the questions. Ask those hard questions of them, of what they're, if they're running, what they're going to do about our military budget and our efforts overseas, and what are you going to do to address the impacts of war that we've already had.
Excellent, Susan. Hard-hitting questions. I think we need to take them to the people who need to listen. Very good. Heidi?
Well, I'd like to conclude this year, America's longest war has ended. And many say we lost the war, but I believe there is another narrative. The sustainable legacy we've left behind of those 6 million fruit trees, and the ability to take the rest of this year to raise our voices, to raise the awareness that we need to lift Afghanistan and put the power in agriculture and get jobs for these young people, well trained by the military, who just need to feed their families. We need the world to invest in development, in peace through agriculture. And it needs to be done now, because in a year from now, when we look at another situation that perhaps is a replicate of history from Iraq, that we just weren't keeping our eye on the ball, the end of the war is in the rearview mirrors. We need to look to the future. We have 45 days. The year's not over. It's time to wage peace.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for giving us a message of hope, of seeing our efforts grow along with the vines in Afghanistan, and inspiring each of us to take what measures we can to do just to help those efforts and to influence our government's policy in each of these areas. Thank you to our fantastic speakers, Dan Jasper, Susan Hammond, and Heidi Kuhn, for joining us today. And I also wish to thank Rebecca Russell and Nora Heffernan for keeping us on track, despite my own glitches in terms of operating the format. The Partnerships for International Strategies in Asia, the George Washington University, the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative, the GW Institute for Korean Studies, the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, and the National Committee on U.S. North Korea. All thank you for participating in this session today. And let's look forward to ways that we can continue to work to heal the wounds of war. Thank you all for attending. Bye.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Linda.